It's a tradition, albeit not a very long-lived tradition, that I start these shows with an opening quote, some kind of commentary on the topic that we're going to be discussing, on the passage that we're going to be reading tonight. I have a great opening quote. We're going to get to it in just a minute. I started it in last week's show because last week we had a bit of a catastrophic technical failure here in the Next Word studio, here in the Shire Reckoning studio, I guess, and things fell apart. The center, it turned out, could not hold. So I had to spend a few days rebuilding my studio setup here, waiting for parts to arrive, waiting for everything to work. So I apologize for my absence from your podcast feed over the course of the last week. And I apologize doubly so if you managed to catch the first, 20 minutes or whatever it was of last week's show, because we're going to be covering the same ground again. That's just how it works when you have to re-record a podcast, I guess. So, hello, welcome to Shire Reckoning. We're going to start the show properly in just a moment, but I wanted to just take this second to say thank you for your patience and for your well wishes as I was moving through the hassle of setting everything up over the course of the last week. In return for that absence, you will hopefully find yourself with much better video quality. We have now moved the live streams over to Patreon rather than YouTube because Patreon offers since I'm paying for it anyway. Since technically you guys are paying for it anyway, it offers a stream that is much less laggy than that public YouTube stream. So there won't be such a large gap between me saying something and you guys responding in the chat. Hopefully the conversation will flow a little more freely, a little more easily, and will be a little more organic as we move forward. Both the public Shire Reckoning stream will be available on Patreon, along with the Last Call at the Green Dragon bonus episode. If you want to join me here live of a Tuesday evening to study the texts, to look at the next chapter of The Hobbit as we continue to move merrily through this book, then you can find the links over at patreon.com/nextword. You can follow that account, that page over on Patreon for free, and that will get you access to these first Tuesday night sessions. And then if you decide to support Next Word to the sum of a few dollars, then you'll be able to join me for the Last Call at the Green Dragon. I'm so unaccustomed to podcasting. It's been like a week since I did a serious podcast. So let's now hopefully get into the show properly. Thank you all for your patience and for joining me here live tonight. Let's begin with that opening quotation. Caverns of awfulest solitude, their walls miles thick, sparkling with ores of gold or silver, copper or iron, tin or mercury, studded perhaps with precious stones, perhaps a brook with eyeless fish in it, running ceaselessly, cold and babbling, through banks crusted with carbuncles and golden topazes, or over a gravel of which some of the stones arc rubies and emeralds, perhaps diamonds and sapphires. Who can tell? And whoever can't tell is free to think, all waiting to flash, waiting for millions of ages, ever since the earth flew off from the sun, a great blot of fire, and began to cool. Welcome, finally, to Shire Reckoning. I'm Alistair Stevens. This opening quote comes from the first chapter of The Princess and the Curdie by George MacDonald, the sequel to The Princess and the Goblin, a book which was initially very influential over Professor Tolkien. I just discovered this last week because Lord knows there is always more to discover about Professor Tolkien. I just discovered this last week that late in his career, I believe this was the late 1960s, he was asked to write a foreword for a new edition of George MacDonald's work. And he hesitated for a little while and then wrote back to his publisher saying that he couldn't write it because George MacDonald had lost his luster for Professor Tolkien, which I just find fascinating. And it is something, of course, that I'm going to dive into more because I will dive into every facet of the man's life eventually. But initially, it is absolutely fair to say that George MacDonald was hugely influential, not just over Professor Tolkien, of course, but also over C.S. Lewis. And certainly, we can hear some echoes of MacDonald's work as we move through chapter 5 of The Hobbit, Riddles in the Dark. As far as the Legendarium is concerned, probably the most influential chapter in The Hobbit. Perhaps not in terms of Bilbo's initial adventure, right? Perhaps not in terms of the journey there and back again, but certainly in terms of the Legendarium as a whole. Brian is joining me here in the live stream for the first time. Brian, it's so good to have you with me. I'm so glad you can make it tonight. I know there have been some teething troubles, but I'm hoping that everything is going to be a little smoother from here on. And of course, when I mention the importance, the relative importance of Riddles in the Dark as a chapter in terms of the Legendarium, I am, of course, referring to two things. I am referring first, of course, to the character of Gollum, and secondarily to the One Ring, which wasn't always the One Ring. It's a well-discussed topic. I think I've mentioned it even over on the Sunday episodes of Shire Reckoning, but I'm going to sketch quickly the history here just so that we can kind of have it in our heads as we're moving forward. I will, I think, probably delve into the the typographic history, right? The textual history of this transformation on some episode in the very near future, because it is completely fascinating. But in the original 1937 version of The Hobbit, Bilbo's encounter with Gollum is very different from the one that is presented to us in the second edition, and the one that therefore is both informed by the writing of The Lord of the Rings and in turn informs our understanding of Gollum as a character in The Lord of the Rings. Because in the first version, the riddle game is this very genial, affable kind of encounter. It doesn't carry the same notes of danger, the same notes of the grotesque, the same notes of the monstrous as we find here in the second edition revision to the manuscript. Gollum agrees during the riddle game to give Bilbo his present if he wins, and it is only upon Bilbo's victory that Gollum returns to his little island, discovers that the ring is missing because Bilbo, even in that version, has already found it, and is so distraught because he cannot keep his promise, that he cannot fulfill the terms of the riddle game, that he then agrees to lead Bilbo out of the Misty Mountains, shake hands, say goodbye, no harm done. And that is, and again, this is the point at which simple revision, right? A simple transformation in the story, a simple editing process becomes something truly magical because of Professor Tolkien's commitment to the authenticity and the validity of his diegetic documents, right? The books themselves exist. These accounts are written down. These stories are told even within the frame of the text as it's presented to us. And that first edition version of The Hobbit is the story that is told by Bilbo to the dwarves and Gandalf upon their emergence on the far side of the Misty Mountains. Oh yeah, I met a weird guy and he was super cool, I guess. And anyway, also I found this ring, and then maybe it turns out that the ring used to belong to that guy. But anyway, we parted on good terms and everything is wonderful, right? That is the lighter version of the story that Bilbo tells the dwarves, possibly, we might contend, under the influence of the ring already. That's one of the reasons that I want to go back and kind of talk about the textual differences, because the other thing that I will mention here is if you compare side by side the first edition and the second edition, you will marvel at how efficiently Professor Tolkien edits these two stories, how he transforms the former into the latter with a real discipline. It is, for the largest part of the chapter, a word here, a subclause here. He's really painstaking in preserving the bulk of the original text. And it's only when we get into the final confrontation that we get extended sessions of rewriting. So, as I say, we'll talk about that in some upcoming episode of Shire Reckoning of a Sunday. Yeah, I'm hesitating now because I'm trying to decide how deeply to go into it, but I don't think we're going to go into it any more deeply than that. I think instead we're going to transition into the reading. We're going to get to the slides that I prepared for this week's session, and we're going to look in some depth at the riddle game, because the riddle game is so curious. It is such an odd, even by the standards of the trolls, right? I've said so many times, books teach you how to read them. They teach you how to understand their underlying metaphors. They teach you how to begin to draw inferences and to have expectations about the fictional world. A good book lays out the path ahead of you so that you can, to some degree, anticipate it, right? Not in terms of spoiling the events of the plot, but in terms of setting an expectation as to the tonality, as to the kinds of things that you will encounter. If you've ever read a book that just takes a weird left turn in the end of the second act, is oftentimes where it happens, right? If you suddenly take a swing into violence that wasn't really, preceded in the text, or some kind of tonal shift, some kind of genre shift, oftentimes that is a function of the book failing to adequately inform you as to what kind of book you are reading, what kind of story you are experiencing. And Tolkien, as I've said before, of course, lays this all out very carefully. It's beautifully, beautifully done. The intrusion of the dwarves sets us up for the trolls, which sets us up for Rivendell, which kind of sets us up for Goblin Town, particularly in terms of the opposition between the goblins that we will see in the Misty Mountains and the dwarves that we are already accompanying. Let's get into our discussion here then of Bilbo finding the ring, and I will show you this first slide. Here we are. When Bilbo opened his eyes, he wondered if he had, for it was just as dark as with them shut. No one was anywhere near him. Just imagine his fright. He could hear nothing, see nothing. He could feel nothing except the stone of the floor. Very slowly he got up and groped about on all fours till he touched the wall of the tunnel, but neither up nor down it could he find anything. Nothing at all. No sign of goblins, no sign of dwarves. His head was swimming, but he was far from certain even of the direction they had been going in when he had his fall. He guessed as well as he could and crawled along for a good way till suddenly his hand met what felt like a tiny ring of cold metal lying on the floor of the tunnel. It was a turning point in his career, but he did not know it. He put the ring in his pocket almost without thinking. Certainly it did not seem of any particular use at the moment. He did not go much further, but sat down on the cold floor and gave himself up to complete miserableness for a long while. He thought of himself frying bacon and eggs in his own kitchen at home, for he could feel inside that it was high time for some meal or other, but that only made him miserabler. I enjoy so much these intrusions of what I've described before as the Tolkien avatar, right? As the author function, as the present day, by which I mean early 20th century, narrator of the events of The Hobbit. The way that Tolkien inserts himself or creates a figure of himself, a simulacrum of himself, between the account that Bilbo relates and the juvenile reader early in the 20th century is just beautiful. It never fails to delight me. And the way that he uses that presence, that intrusion, particularly in this chapter, to mediate the worst of the horror, to mediate the worst of the fear and the desperation that we are going to encounter in a very real and visceral and present way, the way that he manages to ameliorate the sharp edges of that tone and soften it just enough that the juvenile reader can still engage with it, can still recognize it for what it is, but also stay engaged in the story without being too frightened, I think is nothing less than masterful. So we've closed out chapter 4. For those of you coming in just a little late, we've closed out chapter 4 with the goblins sneaking silently through the dark tunnels, wearing their soft shoes, a really weird detail, which I also find oddly delightful. They're chasing the dwarves by the light of Gandalf's staff and finally catching up to them. Dory is carrying Bilbo at that point and is grabbed from behind, and Bilbo falls to the floor, hitting his head, and wakes up in chapter 5. There are 19 chapters in this book, and Bilbo either falls asleep or passes out at the end of 6 of them, which statistically seems like a lot. As I said in the foreshortened episode of this show last week, those aren't Giles from Buffy numbers, right? It's like not as frequent as Anthony Stewart's head character Giles passing out in the show Buffy the Vampire Slayer, but still pretty impressive numbers to be posting. So in that moment, as we awake here in the darkness, completely bereft of sense, right? Literally bereft of sense. He cannot feel, or I guess he can't feel. He cannot see or determine anything around him. There's nothing there. Hear nothing, see nothing, feel nothing except the stone of the floor. And here already, if we are inclined to such supposition, we can feel, I think, the influence of the ring. Because he wakes in complete darkness, doesn't know where he's going, but begins to crawl along the floor. He's just moving, though he doesn't yet know it, toward the ring. Then when he finds the ring, which doesn't seem particularly special, there certainly doesn't seem to be a reason to put it in his pocket, though he does, the minute that he finds the ring, he stops. Perhaps because in that moment he has accomplished the goal that the ring has been setting for him. I have traditionally been kind of a minimalist when I've been looking at the text of The Lord of the Rings in particular and reading the effect, the influence, the intrusion of the ring on the narrative. My personal preference is to pull toward more naturalistic or psychological explanations for as much of the ring's supposed influence as possible. But I have to say, reading The Hobbit again this time, I am swinging far more toward a very, very powerful ring that is frequently more subtle than we normally give it credit for. So Bilbo sets himself down, having accomplished this temporary goal which came upon him unbidden and has now been accomplished. He settles himself down, thinking of frying bacon and eggs in his own kitchen at home, for he could feel inside that it was high time for some meal or other, but that only made him miserabler. And this is the moment when the narrative voice really kicks in. This is, I'm going to advance this slide and then we'll take a look at the narrative voice doing the best version, I think, of what the narrative voice does. Now, certainly Bilbo was in what is called a tight place. But you must remember, it is not quite so tight for him as it would have been for me or for you. Hobbits are not quite like ordinary people. And after all, if their holes are nice, cheery places and properly aired, quite different from the tunnels of the goblins, still they are more used to tunneling than we are, and they do not easily lose their sense of direction underground, not when their heads have recovered from being bumped. Also, they can move very quietly and hide easily and recover wonderfully from falls and bruises, and they have a fund of wisdom and wise sayings that men have mostly never heard, or have forgotten long ago. I should not have liked to have been in Mr. Baggins' place all the same. The tunnel seemed to have no end. All he knew was that it was still going down pretty steadily and keeping in the same direction in spite of a twist or a turn or two. There were passages leading off to the side every now and then, as he knew by the glimmer of his sword or could feel with his hand on the wall. Of these he took no notice except to hurry past for fear of goblins or half-imagined dark things coming out of them. On he went, and down, and still he heard no sound of anything except the occasional whir of a bat by his ears, which startled him at first, till it became too frequent to bother about. I do not know how long he kept on like this, hating to go on, not daring to stop, on, until he was tireder than tired. It seemed like all the way to tomorrow, and over it to the days beyond. So I mentioned the narrative positioning of the narrator here between Bilbo's experience and the juvenile reader, and this is just an extremely deft example of exactly that. And you'll see here the narrator is often ambiguously positioned with regard to Bilbo. It is clearly a narrator possessed of a modern sensibility and certainly a modern frame of reference, right? We get some anachronisms from the narrative voice that we don't get from the diegetic world around Bilbo. But here we're unambiguously setting the narrator, on the couch right there alongside the reader of The Hobbit. Hobbits are not quite like ordinary people, we're told, right? Like me, as it would have been for me or for you, we're given here, right? Not necessarily co-positioning the narrative voice and the reader, but positioning them adjacently at absolute most. All of this then gives us this sense of Bilbo embarking on a completely unprecedented kind of journey, even for a hobbit who is more accustomed to being underground. And this is part of the deftness of that narrative voice, because yes, we are reassuring the reader that actually everything is going to be okay, but, or not so much that everything is going to be okay, I suppose, but rather that Bilbo Baggins is better equipped for this adventure than we would be, or than we might suppose, given our introduction to Bilbo. But then we double down on it. We pull this Uno reverse in terms of narrative pressure and isolate him still further. We emphasize how lonely and dark and deep these tunnels are, right? Going down and down. In spite of a twist or turn or two, this passage just continues. He's being almost pulled down it by narrative insistence here. Let's get very quickly, how am I already running late? This seems impossible. Let's get on to our introduction to Gollum. There are strange things living in the pools and lakes in the hearts of mountains. Fish whose fathers swam in goodness only knows how many years ago and never swam out again, while their eyes grew bigger and bigger and bigger from trying to see in the blackness. Also, there are other things, more slimy than fish. Even in the tunnels and caves the goblins have made for themselves, there are other things living unbeknown to them that have sneaked in from outside to lie up in the dark. Some of these caves, too, go back to the beginnings of ages before the goblins, who only widened them and joined them up with passages, and the original owners are still there in odd corners, slinking and nosing about. Deep down here by the water lived old Gollum, a small, slimy creature. I don't know where he came from, nor who or what he was. He was Gollum, as dark as darkness, except for two big, round, pale eyes in his thin face. He had a little boat, and he rowed it quite quietly on the lake, for lake it was, wide and deep and deadly cold. He paddled it with large feet dangling over the side, but never a ripple did he make. Not he. He was looking out of his pale, lamp-like eyes for blind fish, which he grabbed with his long fingers as quick as thinking. He liked meat, too. Goblin he thought good when he could get it, but he took care they never found him out. He just throttled them from behind if they ever came down alone anywhere near the edge of the water while he was prowling about. They very seldom did, for they had a feeling that something unpleasant was lurking down there, down at the very roots of the mountain. They had come on the lake when they were tunneling down long ago, and they found they could go no further. So there their road ended in that direction, and there was no reason to go that way, unless the great goblin sent them. Sometimes he took a fancy for fish from the lake, and sometimes neither goblin nor fish came back. One of the most effective and monstrous introductions that we get in all of Tolkien's Legendarium. I think this is really an incredibly deft and accomplished piece of characterization of a character that will, as we move on from this point, almost defy this kind of deft characterization, right? Gollum is a complex creature in some ways, more so, of course, when we get into The Lord of the Rings than here in The Hobbit, but still, even here, he is this push-pull of contradiction, which is a situation only exacerbated by this second edition revision to the text. Before we get into some serious analysis of what Gollum is and what Gollum is like, we should note that the description of Gollum there at the beginning of that second para as a small, slimy creature was added in the second edition. That was not present back in that first edition for the more affable and civilized and genial Gollum. And without that edition, illustrators around the world were free to come up with their own interpretations for what Gollum looked like. So before we get into it, I just want to share this slide with you all, which, I know that many people listen to the podcast version of this show, and that's a really strong choice. Check the show notes, because I might just excerpt the slide and drop it into the show notes directly, because everyone should see the images that I'm presenting here. They are kind of fantastic. These are Gollums from around the world. That's Portugal on the left with the large beard there. That's Germany on the top with a situation vis-a-vis his eyes that I just can't quite figure out at all. That is Japan at the bottom, the large frog-like creature kind of giving this two-fingered gesture toward Bilbo. And on the right, the Swedish version, which is little less than horrifying. I find that one really quite upsetting to look at. This is all such a severe situation and so frustrating to Tolkien personally that he would later write to his publishers to complain. He wrote a letter saying, quote, "Gollum should not be made a monster, as he is by practically all other illustrators in disregard of the text." Which, fair enough. And perhaps it's impossible for us now in this post-Jacksonian, post-Circassian world to imagine a version of Gollum that is other than that version, which is now so readily and commonly accepted. But I can't help. I can't find fault or flaw with these illustrators, I have to say, because for all that we get this kind of high-level conceptual sketch of Gollum, we don't get a lot of physical details, right? We get his feet dangling in the water, which we certainly see there in the edition there from Germany and in the edition from Japan too. We get this sense of this creature, but the actual specifics of the creature are very difficult to pin down. So in this way, I think we've lost perhaps a little something in terms of our interpretive space when it comes to Gollum. Let's get back to the slide and take a look at the text itself then. I've talked before about my fondness for what I read to be the professor's inclination toward what we might think of as ancient evil, as cosmic horror, as things from outside the world, beyond the world, beneath the world, right? And the introduction of Gollum here, I think, works on those terms too. I think it works not unlike the Watcher in the Water, not unlike the introduction of Ungoliant, if we go back to the Silmarillion. It is worth remembering, too, that these caves are in the Misty Mountains. They are maybe 220, 240 miles north of Moria, right? Which on the one hand sounds like a lot, I can concede that, but on the other, that is about the same distance from Weathertop to Rivendell. So it's, a fraction of the distance that we've already covered. So it's not impossible that there are, deeper things lurking in these caves. The situation here, the situating here, I suppose, of Gollum as a lonely, wretched creature is very careful. It's very well developed. It's fully realized. It's an aspect of Gollum, I think, which incites our pity even before we get to the second edition, when that pity is much harder to come by, but also much more narratively significant, much more narratively important. He is a wretched creature, and the way that Tolkien manages to navigate that, I think, is flawless. I think it's just perfect. With all that said then, Brian's calling out here in the chat, the animated Hobbit version is my first visualization of Gollum. Not very Hobbit-like. It looks a lot like Japanese Kappa-like interpretation. Yes, exactly, right? Obviously, we're going to have the opportunity here in Shire Reckoning to talk extensively about that animated version, which I will say is a text that I've never really studied in depth. As I've said before, growing up in Britain as I did, I just didn't have the same exposure to that film, which I know had minimal exposure here in the US as well, right? But I think that what small exposure it had here is all but absent from Britain, or at least from the northeast of Scotland where I was growing up. But I'm looking forward to delving deep into it and really tracking some of the creative decisions that were made, because boy, there are some creative decisions made in the production of that film. We must, however, move on to the riddle game. We're going to spend quite some time here because it is the main event of the chapter, but I also want to frame out kind of what our expectations are as we're moving into it, what we're seeing here. In 1938, the year after The Hobbit was published, this is coming from letter 25, which I discussed recently. This is the letter published in the Observer newspaper, which Tolkien wrote, not really intending for it to be published. He wrote in response to a kind of open letter to him, asking some questions about The Hobbit. He wrote this long letter, which the Observer then took and published. And in that letter, the year after the publication of The Hobbit, he said this, quote, "And what about the riddles? There is work to be done here on the sources and analogues. I should not be at all surprised to learn that both The Hobbit and Gollum will find their claim to have invented any of them disallowed." End quote. And in the years since, scholars have done all of the necessary work. All of the riddles in this chapter are broadly, to greater or lesser extents, close to pre-existing riddles. They all have a clear point of origination, or at least a point of clear inspiration, except for Riddle 4, the Wind Riddle, which nonetheless has a lot of features which it shares with other riddles that have the same answer. So even Riddle 4 is not particularly unique. The word riddle is derived, let me come back out of this. I've got this new broadcast setup and I'm still not quite used to it, so I'll come back here on my camera. The word riddle is derived from a Proto-Germanic word meaning reason. But when it comes into English, it comes in with this is a 13th century adoption by English. It comes in with this halo of meanings about imagination and about argumentation and counsel and conversation. So it doesn't really filter out to mean what we now think of as a riddle until the 16th or even the 17th centuries. While I'm doing some etymology here, I did want to note that, where's my note on this? Here it is. Gollum, derived possibly from the Norse word gull, meaning gold. Per Doug Anderson in the annotated Hobbit, Gollum might therefore be interpreted as meaning treasure or precious. It also appears in the compound Norse word fingrgul, meaning finger gold, a word which is usually translated into English as ring. So Gollum's name itself really quite resonant here at the heart of the text. So with all of that said, I guess the last thing to kind of frame out here before we get into the riddle game directly is this. Riddle games were a very common feature of Old English and Anglo-Saxon culture. They were a well-established battle of wits. They were a well-established means of, honestly, passing the time and having a reason to drink in the long, long winters of that period. But they were very well attested. So Tolkien is not creating the idea of the riddle game whole cloth, and he's drawing either directly or indirectly almost all of the riddles from compatible and companionable Anglo-Saxon sources, some more than others, but one in particular is a very clear Anglo-Saxon riddle. We'll get to that in just a moment. So let's take a look. I'm going to put all of these up just so we can have them in front of us. We're not going to spend too long on each one, but there is, I believe, an underlying pattern here or an underlying arc here. I believe that these choices can be opposed. I think that you can oppose all of Gollum's riddles with all of Bilbo's riddles, and they tell us significant things about these two characters. But I believe that you can also, by combining these riddles together, see a sketch of Bilbo's story as it has already been presented to us, as it will, of course, be presented to us. So this, of course, is the first riddle, perhaps the most famous, and the one that Bilbo guesses most quickly, because it turns out that Gollum isn't really trying, and we might infer that Gollum isn't really trying with this first riddle because he is trying to effectively hustle Bilbo, right? He's kind of throwing him an easy one here. He's setting him up for a real solid strike at this riddle so that he can incite him into the game as a whole. But nonetheless, this is the riddle that Gollum first presents. What has roots as nobody sees, is taller than trees, up it goes, and yet never grows? To which Bilbo replies, mountains. Of course, the mountain. A very important symbol within the span of this book. Obviously, also geographically, their location right now, right deep beneath the peaks of the Misty Mountains. But what we see here already is this narrative of dominance that Gollum is going to return to again and again. He is going to evoke and invoke these aspects of power and domination within the frame of his riddles. What has roots as nobody sees, right? What is already deceptive, elusive, unknown to most people? What has roots as nobody sees is taller than trees, right? This direct kind of combative comparison. Up, up it goes, and yet never grows, which introduces the other aspect to which Gollum is going to return again and again, which is this idea of deathlessness, of stasis. Like, this is not a life that is growing and changing and vibrant and dynamic and urgent, and now it is something that is frozen in its time, which is, of course, these riddles, I should mention, unchanged from the first edition of the book, except now loaded with all of this additional meaning, because we're beginning to have a sense, particularly if we're returning to The Hobbit from the pages of The Lord of the Rings, we're beginning to have a sense of Gollum's existence, not just the wretched existence which is sketched for us here as we move into chapter 5, but the existence that we have seen hints of throughout The Lord of the Rings. There is an antagonistic, a combative deathlessness in Gollum's riddles throughout that we'll return to again and again. Let's move quickly on then to Riddle 2, Bilbo's first riddle, a very well-known riddle, particularly to Tolkien's juvenile readership at the time. 30 white horses on a red hill, first they champ, then they stamp, then they stand still. And Gollum responds to this by calling this riddle a chestnut, right? Indicating that it is well known, that it is almost a cliche, which of course it is. It's attested in riddle books throughout the latter part of the 19th century, all the way through into the 20th century. I'm sure you can still buy riddle books, if such things exist even today. I'm sure you can still buy riddle books for children that contain a version of this riddle which is very, very similar. Sometimes there are like an extra couple of lines to give just a few more details, but it's right there for us. I wanted to call out that use of chestnut because I find it so fascinating. It's it's attested from 1885, right, where U.S. actor Joseph Jefferson is giving this interview in which he describes the use of the word chestnut to mean something that is cliche, something that is a trope, like a story that has been repeated again and again and again. And he references this 1816 melodrama called The Broken Sword by William Diamond that features this discussion, this conversation between two characters, Captain Xavier and Pablo, where Xavier is repeating this story that he has clearly told again and again and again and again. And when he gets to a particular detail, he mentions this cork tree. Suddenly from the thick boughs of a cork tree, and Pablo jumps up saying, a chestnut, Captain, a chestnut. And Xavier says, no, it was absolutely a cork tree. And Pablo says, well, every other time that I've heard this story, which have been many, it was a chestnut tree. Thus, chestnut is adopted thanks to the intrusion of Joseph Jefferson as a useful shorthand to mean these stories, which have become almost denuded of meaning, right? As cliches are. That is the problem with cliches in English, is not that they are inherently bad. It is that through repetition, they have been stripped of all of their meaning. They have lost their juice. That is why they are bad, is that they are bland. They have been rendered meaningless by repetition rather than any kind of inherent lack of quality. Brian's saying, as a geology student, and yet never grows doesn't ring true, but from their perspective, it's true enough. Yes, of course. No medieval sense of plate tectonics, but you're absolutely right. The world is ever-changing, but certainly not in Tolkien's created schematic, right? We see what we see of geology, and I've kind of hinted at this before, but Tolkien, though a master of many things, you can tell from his maps, clearly not a master of how mountain ranges are formed. The formation of the world of Arda is a formation of conscious thought and deliberate action, rather than, yes, the events of the Silmarillion, as Brian calls out here. Exactly right. So that's our second riddle here. And here we see a feature that's going to recur in Bilbo's riddles, which is to say things which are domestic, things which are internal, things which are cozy, things which bespeak a relatively comfortable life. This perhaps is less surprising than the kind of associations that we can draw from Gollum's riddles, because Bilbo is already within this chapter thinking of these features of his cozy life back at Bag End. But it is an interesting opposition, particularly as Gollum begins to respond to and heighten his own riddles in return. This is illustrated for us really beautifully here by Gollum pointing out that he only has 6 teeth rather than the requisite 30. Let's take a look as we move on to... Oh, Brian's asking... So now would be the appropriate time to ask, assuming Gollum hasn't lost more teeth since the events of Riddles in the Dark, how on Middle-earth did Gollum manage to bite off Frodo's finger with only 6 teeth? Or shall we wait however long it takes us to get to the Mount Doom chapter of the Return of the King? He doesn't say which teeth, right? He is accustomed to eating meat. So I can perhaps speculate that his biting teeth, his canines, his incisors, that his incisors will still incise, seems to me to be a reasonable explanation, given the fact that we're told that, he just earlier this day went off and ate a fresh young goblin. That's part of the reason why he's being so affable with Bilbo, but it's also, the explanation for the ring slipping off of his finger. But yeah, you're right. Certainly, as he is presented to us in the Jackson films, I find that a little harder to navigate, for sure. I do think that perhaps Gollum has taken a degree or two further than he might be in terms of his decrepitude, I suppose, right? His pitiable decrepitude. Let's move on. Great question, though, Brian. Thank you for that. Let's move on to our next riddle and the response to the teeth riddle. This is Gollum again, kind of playing it safe. This is Gollum coming from his usual sources of riddles. Voiceless, it cries, wingless, flutters, toothless, bites, mouthless, mutters. Toothless bites here being the clearest kind of denial or abrogation of what Bilbo is putting forth, but we're also kind of denying personhood here, right? The wind here is defined in terms of what it is not, in terms of what it cannot. It is voiceless, it is wingless, it is toothless, it is mouthless. These are things which it does not possess. It is kind of delineated in the negation of its being. And that, of course, ties in with these continuing themes that we're seeing from Gollum. Bilbo picks this one up quickly enough. It's a straightforward enough riddle. Again, this is not particularly unusual as a riddle. There's a ongoing kind of discourse about these kinds of riddles where the answer is always nothing, wind, or time, right? That seems to be the common kind of set of answers that we return to again and again. But what's really interesting about this riddle is how Bilbo moves on from it, because what we get is a very atypical Bilbo riddle. An eye in a blue face, so an eye in a green face. That eye is like to this eye, said the first eye, but in a low place, not in a high place. And this is the one that, as I say, isn't completely trackable, right? We're not completely, there is no version of this riddle written word for word in any other sources, at least not that I could find, but it is kind of tied back to a rhythm and a cadence of Anglo-Saxon riddle writing, not least of all because it is dependent on an Anglo-Saxon pun here, right? As Gollum correctly identifies, the solution to this riddle is the sun on the daisies. But that riddle only works if you are cognizant of the fact that in Anglo-Saxon, the word daisy is derived from the day's eye. It is derived from this idea of the daisy being like unto a little sun. So there's an established kind of etymological connection between these two things, which would not necessarily be clear to Gollum in this cave deep under the Misty Mountains, though I guess that's inviting a whole conversation about what language is being spoken by Gollum throughout the Legendarium, and that's maybe more of a conversation than we want to have right now. But it is clear, right? Bilbo is returning to light and air and comfort, right? He's kind of pushing back against the denial of existence, right? All of the things which Gollum denies the wind are here reversed because the sun is being actively embodied. An eye in a blue face, so an eye in a green face. And not just that it exists, not just that it is present, not just that it is there, that it is a concrete thing, as opposed to the wind in the previous riddle, but it's given attributed dialogue, right? That eye is like to this eye, said the first eye, but in low place, not in high place. Of all of the riddles, this is perhaps the one that I am least convinced would work in real life. I don't think that Gollum in real life is figuring out the answer to this one. Gollum, though, pulls a very classic, and by this point almost expected, trick with his response and riddle 5. It cannot be seen, cannot be felt, cannot be heard, cannot be smelt. It lies behind stars and under hills and empty holes it fills. It comes first and follows after, ends life, kills laughter. This is the the dark riddle, right? This is a very traditional form of riddle, as I said, right? Nothing, time, shadows, right? All of these kind of semi-abstracted things. They are very common answers to riddles, particularly riddles in the Anglo-Saxon mold. This is a classic example. But what's interesting about this riddle too is what it is doing in terms of its positioning with regard to Bilbo, right? We're kind of pushing back against, obviously, the idea of the sun is opposed with the idea of darkness. But Gollum, again, presenting darkness in terms of what it is not, at least in this initial part, right? It cannot be seen, cannot be felt, cannot be heard, cannot be smelled. It is an absence. It is not a thing that is present. It is the removal of a thing that is essential, a thing, in fact, which is so important to Bilbo's previous riddle. And it's given this attribute of again, dominance, right? It lies behind stars and under hills. Oh, it is the default mode of the universe, right? There is darkness everywhere. The light doesn't reach everywhere. And where it doesn't reach, there is always darkness. So darkness is positioned as this fundamental thing. Empty holes it fills. It comes first and follows after. Not just spatially all-encompassing, but temporally all-encompassing, right? The sun is great, but it's not been there for that. I mean, literally, in Arda, it hasn't been there for that long, right? It was created just a few thousand years ago. But still, we're kind of positioning the dark as the dominant force and the sun, the light, as the temporary exception. And of course, there, in that last line, we're doing the same with life. We're doing the same with laughter. So Bilbo responds to this by, I think, taking that idea of enclosure, taking that idea of darkness bracketing the world, and again, doing what Bilbo does and repositioning it, right? Giving us, again, another real chestnut, another real classic riddle. A box without hinges, key or lid, yet golden treasure inside is hid. Gollum correctly guesses egg. We get that great little anecdotal biographical detail that he's thinking of it because of how he taught his grandmother to suck eggs, which is, again, I take to be another intrusion of that modern author. This, though, is where it gets really interesting because Gollum responds to this, thinking about food, presumably, right, by moving into his fish riddle, which will be incorporated into Gollum's extemporaneous song in the Passage of the Marshes, right? The second chapter of Book 4 of The Lord of the Rings. We're going to get this recapitulation, this long-form recapitulation of this riddle, including the acknowledgement that Bilbo guessed the answer correctly. That's when Frodo and Sam and Gollum are crossing the dead marshes. Alive without breath, as cold as death, never thirsty, ever drinking, all in mail, never clinking. And this is the point where, well, if we haven't already intuited or inferred the existence of some unusual luck on Bilbo's part, right? The unexpected luck of widows' sons, of course, right? Since Belladonna outlived Bungo, it's not inappropriate to kind of draw that early reference that Bilbo makes to Gandalf's stories, the unexpected luck of widows' sons, and apply it to Bilbo directly. Because we've seen some tremendous luck, nothing compared to what we're going to see from this point onward. This really is a turning point for Bilbo. But there is, I think, something very lucky about our burglar, for sure. But this is the point at which it becomes active, right? This is the point where the fish jumps out of the water at the splash of Gollum's feet, right? Gollum is impatient. He splashes his feet. A fish jumps out and, hey, Bilbo has the answer to the riddle. It could not have worked out better. What a lucky boy is he. And there's an inclination, I think, in the readership to credit this intrusion to Iluvatar, that this is just a moment of kind of divine grace. This is a moment of eucatastrophe here early in Bilbo's career. Chance, if chance you call it, as Tom Bombadil would have it. But, you know, now that we're thinking about the ring, now that we're thinking about the capability of the ring, now that we're thinking about the power of the ring, now that we're thinking about the ring manipulating Bilbo along the tunnel right at the beginning of the chapter until he finds the ring and puts it in his pocket, perhaps we can extend here our understanding of what the ring is capable of and how it takes direct action. It wants to, well, this is inference, right? This is speculation at this point. But if the ring wants to be with Bilbo, it can offer a solution to the riddle by making a fish jump out of the lake in that moment. Perhaps we do not credit the ring with that kind of power, with that kind of capacity, that kind of capability. Or perhaps we do. Let's keep moving on here because time is running short and we still have 2 more to get through. I guess, technically 3 more to get through, but we'll talk about the last one last of all. Bilbo here taking another pivot away from this idea, right? Alive without breath, as cold as death, never thirsty, ever drinking, all in mail, never clinking. Again, we see the deathlessness. Again, we see this unchangingness, right? The fish as it is presented in the lines of this riddle is this undead, unchanging creature that just exists, never thirsty, ever drinking, all in mail, never clinking, right? We get this idea of compatibility here between this riddle and Gollum's previous riddles. And as the text acknowledges, Bilbo really takes a direct A to B route here in order to get to his next riddle. No legs lay on 1 leg, 2 legs sat near on 3 legs, 4 legs got some. I am not much of a cat guy. I feel like, hey, listener of Shire Reckoning, we've known each other for a while now. I can confess this. I'm in good company. I'm not much of a cat guy, but if I were, I do think that 4 legs would maybe just be the best name for a cat. Or, barring Tevildo, Prince of Cats, that's maybe number 1. But then if you insist on getting a second cat, maybe just call that cat 4 legs. I think that kind of works for me. Again, we're seeing the movement here from Gollum's kind of ominous, dark, monstrous, almost gothically inflected riddle to Bilbo's picture of domestic satisfaction, right? Not just food, not just warmth, not just comfort, but also company. Crucially, kind of leveraging that idea of loneliness that we established with Gollum back when that character was introduced. All of this works. Not a very good riddle. Not enough to foil Gollum's ambitions here, but still. Let's get to the last one, and let's move on to Gollum's final riddle here, the time riddle. This thing all things devours, birds, beasts, trees, flowers, gnaws iron, bites steel, grinds hard stones to meal, slays kings, ruins towns, and beats high mountains down. Adding a few plurals there at the end. Slays king, ruins town, and beats high mountain down. And of course, though, again, classic riddle answer, classic kind of universal, Gollum is thinking almost cosmologically, right? Almost fundamentally here in his creation of his riddles, but he is thinking of something that conquers all. Having thought of darkness, now we're moving on to this idea of the ultimate implacable foe. Time itself will crush everything. But I don't think it's accidental. As Bilbo favors these more modern, more domestic riddles, as Gollum favors these impersonal, cold, dark, Bilbo's domestic, warm, light, Gollum's older, generally, in terms of their sources than Bilbo's. We can see all of this competition here. We can see the contrast between these two characters, and we can infer from that a great deal of accurate information, as we know from later readings, about their characters. But there is something else happening here as we move toward the end of the riddle game, because an alternative answer to large parts of this riddle in particular might be Smaug. This thing all things devours, birds, beasts, trees, flowers, gnaws iron, bites steel, grinds hard stones to meal. Okay, maybe not so much the first 4 lines, but these last 2 lines? Slays king, ruins town, and beats high mountain down. Well, that's completely compatible with what we heard of Smaug from the dwarf song back in the first chapter. And we might be able to build an argument, right, that the riddles in general relate out, that they connect out to the rest of the story. We begin the riddle game with the mountain, which evokes the image of Erebor summoned by the dwarves in that song in the first chapter. Bilbo responds with teeth, which is harder to connect, honestly, if we're being completely generous and transparent about it, but maybe he's thinking of the unexpected party and the possibility that he heroically might have to go without cakes. The third riddle is the wind riddle, which echoes, of course, that passage, that brilliantly constructed passage in the Misty Mountain song. The pines were roaring on the height, the winds were moaning in the night, the fire was red, it flaming spread, the trees like torches blazed with light, which then carries us into the daisy riddle, which could possibly be connected in terms of its, well, in terms of 2 things. In terms of its evocation of the natural world, its repositioning of experience as a thing which is concordant and harmonious with the natural world as it exists, but which also draws a connection between the sun in the high place and the daisy in the low place, and the sun's condescension to the daisy. That eye is like this eye. It's recognizing a kinship in that moment. I mean, I think that you could look at the introduction, the first encounter with the elves in terms of tracking the whole story, right? So we go from the image of the mountain and we go from the party, we go through the song and the evocation of the wind, all the way to our first encounter with the tra-la-la-lolly down in the valley elves, who I think would be completely justified in looking upon the dwarves and the Hobbit and saying, those eyes are like to these eyes, but in low place, not in high place. Darkness, then, has been significant several times in the course of the story, but you know, we get we must away ere break of day. We get the trolls being turned to stone by the coming dawn. We get the listening to the music, the song of the elves under the stars and its restorative magic, and we get the magic of the moon letters too. And I think that may be where we position the darkness riddle. And I'll admit, the building out of this schematic, I'm kind of opening this up to you guys at this point, because the building out of the schematic gets into some trouble when we get to 6, 7, and 8, egg, fish, and, you know, fish the second time. But you could argue, if you were so inclined, I think that the egg riddle foreshadows the Lonely Mountain itself, with the existence of this treasure, right? Golden treasure is hid, but it's a treasure that isn't as easy to get to as might be first thought, or treasure that demands action be taken before the treasure itself can be seized. The first fish that we see in Gollum's poem might be seen as a representation of Gollum himself, perhaps odd, unnatural, out of his element, not literally, you know, alive without breath or as cold as death, but metaphorically, representationally, cold, alone, silent beneath the mountain, which might also representationally connect Gollum to Smaug. Bilbo's fish riddle, therefore, and the repositioning of this silent, unnatural fish as the object of this happy little domestic scene, right? We might be inclined to look at the eating of the fish, the reward of the encounter with the fish by the man and the cat in community, in cooperative spirit, as being something like the dwarves and the elves and the men at the end of the story, post-Battle of the Five Armies, positioning Smaug as the fish that is metaphorically eaten. And this, interpretive schematic, I guess, right, is capped or keyed by Gollum's final riddle, the time riddle. All of these things, from the image of the mountain, the beats high mountain down that we get here, right? From the image of the mountain and the unexpected party to the wind and the heights, down the road to the elves and the darkness of their night, or the darkness under the mountain, to the treasure of Erebor, to Smaug and the aftermath of Smaug, and time for all of it, of course. And further still, right? If we extend this one step further, then we get the unanswered final riddle, the solution to which is, of course, the One Ring, the symbol of what will come next. Okay, let's push on as we move through. Brian's noting, apparently you're in good company in terms of your feelings about cats. Yes, the professor and I share a certain harmonious compatibility there vis-a-vis cats. This then is our look at the riddle game itself. Time's up, he said. String or nothing, shrieked Gollum, which was not quite fair, working in two guesses at once. Both wrong, cried Bilbo, very much relieved, and he jumped at once to his feet and put his back to the nearest wall and held out his little sword. He knew, of course, that the riddle game was sacred and of immense antiquity, and even wicked creatures were afraid to cheat when they played at it. But he felt he could not trust this slimy thing to keep any promise at a pinch. Any excuse would do for him to slide out of it, and after all, that last question had not been a genuine riddle, according to the ancient laws. This is an odd one. This is an interesting one, particularly if you were with me for our discussion of the Silmarillion over on Stars and Swords and our repeated consideration of the word hallowed. Because the word sacred is not a word that Tolkien uses, like not casually, certainly not frequently. This is the only time that it appears in this book. It appears only once in the text of The Lord of the Rings, when Gimli, exuberant at his message from Galadriel from the return, his message that he receives from Galadriel from the returned Gandalf the White, right? He makes a joke about Gandalf's sacred head. That's the only time that it appears in that actual story. The only other time it appears in that book is in the prologue, referring to this riddle game, addressing Bilbo's last question. In fact, this is the quote from the prologue to The Lord of the Rings. Quote, The authorities, it is true, differ whether this last question was a mere question and not a riddle according to the strict rules of the game, but all agree that after accepting it and trying to guess the answer, Gollum was bound by his promise. And Bilbo pressed him to keep his word, for the thought came to him that this slimy creature might prove false, even though such promises were held sacred, and of old all but the wickedest things feared to break them. So there is, as I mentioned earlier, a kind of historical thread that we can track back from this instance of the riddle game back into our own medieval antiquity, and by extension through to the roots of Middle Earth, transliterated through Tolkien's own medievalism. The riddle game was important. Games are important. Rules are important if we are going to have a stable, prosperous society. In order for us to feel that we can engage in these kinds of contests, these kinds of competitions, we have to be fairly certain that everyone is going to compete by the same rules and that those rules are going to be enforced, which is a harder thing to get to, right? There's a sense of common decency in terms of how the riddle game is pursued, how it's presented to us right here, but it's harder to kind of drill down through that to the authorities, as we're told in the prologue, who are responsible for the game. And I don't raise this to suggest that way out there, way out in the West, there is a Maya who is secretly responsible for the riddle game. Although there might be, right? Maybe there is I don't know. I would need to figure that out. Who is the possibly some supporter of Tukas, right? Probably someone out there kind of figuring out how these games and contests are administrated. But I'm not suggesting that Tolkien is really introducing that as a serious idea, but rather making this appeal to social stability. And what's so interesting about that, of course, is that we are not going to find out the real nature of Gollum until we get to the beginning of The Lord of the Rings. But here, even acknowledging that these two individuals, Bilbo on the one hand, Gollum on the other, are bound by the same sets of rules and conventions and expectations, does suggest a shared social space between the two. We're not going to get these same kind of expectations from, the goblins that we've encountered, from the trolls that we've encountered. The trolls are positioned as being almost subject to the same kind of societal conventions, but then their transgressions are presented so powerfully, so immediately, so forcefully, that it's difficult to kind of situate them in the same social schematic as Bilbo or certainly the dwarves. But here there is something, particularly in the first edition, there is something suggestive, that something which encourages us to see a connection between Bilbo and Gollum, which of course becomes metaphorically so charged when we get into The Lord of the Rings and we see what is happening with Bilbo because of his possession of the ring. Speaking of which, just a couple slides to finish up this evening. My birthday present, he whispered to himself as he had often done in the endless dark days. That's what he wants now. Yes, he wants it. He wanted it because it was a ring of power. And if you slipped that ring on your finger, you were invisible. Only in the full sunlight could you be seen, and then only by your shadow, and that would be shaky and faint. My birthday present! It came to me on my birthday, my precious! So he had always said to himself. But who knows how Gollum came by that present ages ago in the old days when such rings were still at large in the world. Perhaps even the master who ruled them could not have said. Gollum used to wear it at first till it tired him. And then he kept it in a pouch next to his skin till it galled him. And now usually he hid it in a hole in the rock on his island, and he was always going back to look at it. And still sometimes he put it on when he could not bear to be parted from it any longer, or when he was very, very hungry and tired of fish. Then he would creep along dark passages looking for stray goblins. He might even venture into places where the torches were lit and made his eyes blink and smart, for he would be safe. Oh yes, quite safe. No one would see him. No one would notice him till he had his fingers on their throat. Only a few hours ago he had worn it and caught a small goblin imp. How it squeaked. He still had a bone or two left to gnaw, but he wanted something softer. And I am now officially at time, but we're going to take just a second to talk about what is presented here unambiguously, I think, as an antagonistic relationship between Gollum and the ring. This portrait of obsession I find to be extremely compelling, right? He has this this love of the ring. He used to wear it at first till it tired him, we're told. Then he kept it in a pouch next to his skin till it galled him. Now usually he hid it in a hole on the rock of his island, wanting to be further and further away from it, right? Not even wanting the immediacy of its utility, but wanting to be further and further away from it, but still compelled back to it all the time. Was always going back to look at it, we're told. The possession of the ring and the theoretical situating of Gollum as a content creature, right? Like Smaug upon his treasure, here beneath the bowels of the misty mountains. That idea, if you're holding on to that idea at this point in the text, is completely stripped away from us at this point. We are forced to confront this antagonistic, awfully destructive relationship between Gollum and the object of his desire. I wanted to call out too earlier that the word precious is used far fewer times than you would expect as you're moving through this chapter, and that Gollum is using it to describe himself rather than the ring. There's a kind of Flandersization that happens there, right? There's a kind of positioning in the popular consciousness, in the pop cultural landscape of the precious as being the ring, but it is much more complex than that when we're given it here on the page, which is, of course, the triumph of Professor Tolkien's work. These things are complicated. What we have seen in the passages that we've covered tonight, I'm going to, I think, probably hold Bilbo's moment of pity and his escape through the door and the loss of his brass buttons until next week's session. We can pick that up right before we get to Out of the Frying Pan and Into the Fire. Let me come back here just to talk about this a little bit. What we've seen in tonight's reading, for all that it is superficial in some senses, for all that it is bounded by, constrained by, ordered by, formalized by the rules of the riddle game, is an incredibly complex and combative, kind of confrontational depiction of these two characters, neither one of whom is in their perfect environment, right? Neither one of whom is in their natural environment. They are both, I think, bound here beneath the mountain out of a product of circumstances, but without any real hope of changing that. And all of this, the positioning of Bilbo and Gollum together, but so very far apart, I think is really a dramatic testament to the skill of the professor as an author. And that is going to absolutely take it, I'm afraid, to the end of the show, because I have to wrap up and I have to go and get ready for the Patreon exclusive after show, where I might just talk a little bit more about Gollum. Who knows? Maybe speculate a little bit about the hunt for Gollum that we're going to be looking at in, 18 months or whatever, the upcoming movie adaptation of that part of Aragorn's life, which is really how I'm positioning it mentally so that I can remain excited about it as we move forward. I hope that you'll be able to join me if you are listening to this after the fact, if you're listening to this in the podcast, if you're listening to this over on YouTube after the fact, then by all means head on over to shirereckoningpod.com and check out the show notes. You'll be able to find links to the slides that I've used tonight to discuss Riddles in the Dark, but also by the time that this podcast is posted, a outline, a schedule, a production schedule for the rest of our time covering The Hobbit, which is going to take us, a good couple of months to get through here on the show. But hey, we are in no hurry. We have world enough in time to finally spend as long as we like moving through the pages of this book. The first few chapters, I will admit, have moved fairly quickly, but there's a lot more to get into now that we are about to emerge from the Misty Mountains into the wild, right? Really, there is a powerful sense in which the mountains themselves, brackets, this encounter with Gollum, brackets, picking up the ring, are the threshold. That is the defining moment that marks the transition from Bilbo's safe and ordered life into a world of high adventure. We're going to get to all of that next week. As I say, with Chapter 6, Out of the Frying Pan and Into the Fire. Please check out Shire Reckoning Pod for more. If you're listening to this after the fact, if you're listening to the podcast version, please do head on over to patreon.com/nextword. You can follow that page for free to get access to these live sessions, or you can throw a couple bucks a month my way in order to help me keep making podcasts. It's so good to be back. It's so good to be talking about The Hobbit again. I can't wait to do it more, honestly. Maybe I should figure out some kind of suggestion of some possibility for doing this longer, for extending these shows, but that's probably not a conversation for tonight. That's going to do it, in fact, for this episode. Thank you so much for listening. Brian, thank you so much for joining me live. I hope you had a good time. I hope I'll see you again next week. I'll be back with more then. Until then, take care. Good night all.